Hey everybody, how are you guys doing? I'm Eric Gerlach, and this is a talk, a special one for me, on Edgar Allan Poe, Poe's detective stories, and philosophy. Specifically, leading to talks I am going to make on the work of Lewis Carroll and Wittgenstein and how their work can best help us to understand logic and emotions and how all of that works together with objects, memories, and all of it as human thought. Now, I believe it's 2018, I made a very wonderful discovery of Poe's detective stories. I did not know at the time, when I picked up the book, I was in a used bookstore. My favorite one in Berkeley, this berserkly town, is Moe's Books, and I need to plug, bail, because I love Moe so much. They do not pay me. Again, don't wear the t-shirt. But I was in another bookstore, gasp, concern, and I saw a stack of volumes for cheap of Edgar Allan Poe's detective stories and other writings. And I thought, well, I'm getting really into detective fiction, and I know that Wittgenstein, who's my favorite modern philosopher, loved detective fiction, plot twists, situational thinking. So given that, and that Poe wrote detective stories, I thought this is wonderful, and I did not know at the time that Poe is somewhat the inventor of the plot twist, the detective story in modern terms. These are, of course, human literary writing, telling stories orally before writing techniques. But Poe is, in many ways, the popularizer and early innovator of the short story, the short sci-fi story, the short horror story, and the murder mystery. Now, there are precedents in China, and there is a French and German detective or two in earlier centuries. But Poe's detective Dupin, and I'm going to call him Dupin, not Dupin or Dupin. I'm going to call him Dupin consistently as an American, because I think that's what Poe is implying. He is duping people as Dupin, and not so French, or perhaps, yes, French indeed, but imaginary still. But I began reading Poe's detective stories because I had to get on a plane to visit friends. And I started, and before the plane took off, in the first few pages, I realized that I was hanging on to something that was extraordinarily like Nietzsche and Wittgenstein, but in English and earlier. Poe's detective stories became the model, very much Dupin became the model, one of, if not the central model, for Doyle's later Sherlock Holmes. Now, Sherlock Holmes is presented as a character who, like Spock, finds emotions a muddle. He is an emotional person, unlike Spock so much, who still has to be motivated to say anything. But Sherlock Holmes is very uptight and passionate, but he really sees other people's emotions as kind of a problem. He's not sensitive to them, doesn't pick up on them very well. Dupin is very much the opposite, which makes it interesting that he's the inspiration for the later, more famous Holmes, in spite of the fact that Poe is an American and came up with the earlier model. Poe's Dupin is so sensitive to the emotions of others and the perspectives of others, and that he has to stay indoors and only go out at night, we think at first, although the third story calls this into question, very much. And the detective tells the narrator, who is the earlier Doc Watson, the narrator of these stories, who is basically the Dr. Watson, I presume, wherever, in London or the jungle, is that with all of this, his detective says, I can read people so easily, and people think that believing in math or science or modernity or what have you, or mechanics, is brilliance, but actually real genius is half poetry, half math, half poetry, and that is why I can read people and understand and think so much better than others. And that fits so well with the stuff that I've been trying to connect between Lewis Carroll and Wittgenstein, and what I've been trying to say in many ways about the thinkers I like, including Nietzsche and Wittgenstein, but many others across India, Greece, and China, about how logic and human thought are subjective and objective, an emotional and an anti-emotional affair of all of these different moving parts. Poe's detective stories put this stuff simplest and best, even though they are a puzzle and a device. And in studying the stories, I believe that I have made some discoveries and insights that I think are arguably there that others don't seem to have indicated and pointed to. And then in the process, I actually got to things in Lewis Carroll, and I knew I'm going to go thoroughly through this before I do Lewis Carroll. And in the process, I came up with things about Aristotle and Lewis Carroll that I am going to give specifically following these talks. So what this is the first of 4 talks on Edgar Allan Poe's detective stories. First, Poe and his life as a background for the detective stories, and then a short talk on each of the following 3, and he only wrote 3 of them in the years before he died. 3 detective stories in which I will argue there is a hidden crime in each of them that he wants you to find and solve as a part of a puzzle. I'm going to present it that way. I do believe it's an arguable theory, and it is quite clear that the second story, which was based on a real crime, did have a hidden crime in the middle. In fact, it's quite too obvious because it was based on a real crime, and then when that real crime went in directions Poe didn't intend, other authors and scholars have thankfully, I am not the Poe scholar, by the way, nor am I the Carroll scholar, but I am a philosophy instructor who happens to love Wittgenstein, and how much Wittgenstein appreciated Carroll, Lewis Carroll in Wonderland. And I think that Poe's detective stories and reading players in a card game, which he says in the opening pages, and reading people emotionally as a core piece of what logic and thought is very key to understanding Carroll and Wittgenstein for me. But I will make that case in following videos following these 4. These 4 videos, which I am making before I make the videos for the Carroll Society about the connections between Aristotle's categories and Wonderland and the Looking Glass and the Snark that I am going to make after these 4. That I'm going to make these 4 short films on Poe, his life, the first, the second, and the third stories, and then I'm going to turn to Wonderland, the Looking Glass, and then after that, in the month of May, will be Wittgenstein month for me, in which I will explain what in Wittgenstein I appreciate in all of this. Wittgenstein is the last great, amazing philosopher, at least as far as the American, well, the good old US of A, aka the Americas. I don't know. The part, the whole composition, decomposition. All of this, Wittgenstein is the last great philosopher, according to a bunch of American philosophers, philosophy professors, whomever. And also, the person trying to be the next great genius is trying to be the next Wittgenstein. So figuring out Wittgenstein's thought, it became clear to me studying at Berkeley and in this town. You want to try to be something like Wittgenstein. What was he? How was he? Well, I got to learn with Sluga, Stroud, others, things in this town, Dreyfus, Roche, many folks. And learn from folks I didn't get to take classes with, but the work to which I am indebted, Lakoff and Johnson, Gopnik, several other people in psychology, Cog Sci. But with all of this, I do believe in a Wittgensteinian logic that says we are actually several things overlapping, including words. Many people have focused on words or mathematical forms to understand human logic. The best way of understanding human logic is to see it as a knitting of many different diverse elements together, specifically words, but also words are the last thing the 2 or 3-year-old learns before, the cats are scratching, in anticipation, before having feelings, objects, and having memories of having feelings, objects, others, and all of this interwoven along with then words as physical objects that are emotional, have emotional content, that have emotions interwoven with them, and objects referring to objects, that these diverse elements interwoven, like the sheep knitting the confusing 12 pairs of knitting needles, bewildering Alice in the middle of the second of Alice's adventures, The Looking Glass, but also like Wittgenstein, which is very Buddhist. I like Kalu Pahana's Buddhist philosophy as a book. He studied with a guy who studied with a guy who studied with a guy who studied with Wittgenstein. And Wittgenstein's ideas are very similar in ways to Buddhism and Buddhist logic. You will not find a bedrock element. What you will find is several based bedrock elements that all don't have to be there at once in any particular situation. Words are one of those, which is why for Wittgenstein flipping off a motorist could be incredibly important without a single word, but just a gesture. And what people mistakenly think of as the logic internally, which is rules in us or math, is actually the regular practices we emotionally have with words out in the world with others as cultural forms of life. Now, what I'm going to argue, and I'm going to turn to Edgar Allan Poe's life right now, is Edgar Allan Poe's detective stories brilliantly show that, and then I am going to argue Lewis Carroll knew of Poe's detective stories. I'm not going to argue that though these detective stories had this direct impact on Wonderland. I'm going to leave all of that open, but I am then going to show how Carroll, knowing of Poe, thinking Poe was a great genius, knowing of Poe and Dickens and those folks and their squabbles, etc., Carroll then goes on to write a Wonderland and Looking Glass and the Snark as emotions and logic and absurd characters all entangled together, which reflects Aristotle and Aristotle's problems and strengths for Carroll, I'm going to argue. And then with Wittgenstein, I'm going to get into why he liked murder mysteries and plot twists in comedies and pratfalls in comedies in America, silent movies, etc. I'm going to argue why situational thinking is better than, more pragmatic and better for understanding thought than something like formal logic with formalized rules. And I'm going to show that by, first and foremost here, getting into Poe's life. Thank you for the patience through my 10-minute spiely intro here. But let's get into Poe's horrifying life and career. And then I will conclude this talk on Poe's life, and I will then give a longer talk on the first detective story, which will be the longest of these Poe talks, and then I will follow with a talk on the second, and then a talk on the third, in which I will argue that the lover of the Queen, which no one seems to have tried to solve, but the ending quotes and words of the first story say, "Solve what hasn't been solved," as if Poe leaves X's for us. We're supposed to solve them, and if there's a big X sitting in the room, we're kind of supposed to solve it. And if that's true, there seems to have been a murder in the Murders in the Rue Morgue that isn't indicated or revealed in the end, that is quite there in the pieces. There is definitely a crime that is rather horrific in the middle of the second story, which was an actual crime that then Poe may have been wrong about and embarrassed about. And then he goes back to writing a fantastic, fictional, quite fictional, it's arguable back and forth how fictional is fact and fact fiction. He argues in the third story, which he goes back to writing a more fictional story, less based directly on an actual crime. And there is a lover of the Queen, and people don't seem to speculate, but the best solution to who is the lover of the Queen, I think, will present itself as most obvious once we are looking to do what Poe says to do through his narrator and through his detective, and then narrator and himself, I suppose. All of these lenses, which is just only Poe. That's as we interpret him and back and forth, if he can still thrive and live. That with all of this, what Poe is doing is suggesting that there is a hidden crime that can be solved in each of the three stories. The second one is a bit the most muddled because it is mixed with direct reality for Poe, actual events in his life, and in the newspapers of the time. But I will go on to suggest there's a hidden murder and a murderer who is suggested falsely to be the murderer, but then is actually a murderer in the first story. And the clues are all there. And we're told in the very end to solve what hasn't been solved, and we are left on those words as if it's a puzzle. And then the second story, it is more obvious what is all going on, at least even in the mix-up of it. In the third story, I think it is very clearly being suggested that Dupin is the Queen's lover himself. He is the best option. If we are supposed to solve for X each time, it makes sense. I do not believe that anybody has proposed that Dupin is himself Dupin, what have yous, for the American I ams. He's the Queen's lover, and it makes a lot of sense. And it makes the three stories wrap up such that there is a hidden extra part of each of the stories, even as each of them are quite entertaining just on its own. But reading the opening and the closing quotes of the first story, it does seem like there's hidden crimes in each. So onward now, let us pick up here after this intro talk to Poe's horrifying life and career, as I'm getting along to. So Edgar Allan Poe, who lived from 1809 to 1849. He wrote those detective stories in, I think, 44, 45, 46. So in the years before he died, and did not have time to mention or not whether or not there was this or that. Not much time. Was born in Boston to a pair of poor actors who were dead before Poe was 3. Many great philosophers and thinkers usually have a parent or two, kind of Bambi out of the picture, and usually are alive in warring times. And Poe was in the antebellum South. So John Allan, I still have to look up Allan each time. You know, I'm the kind of person who I need to look up, is it Allan A, E, and I have issues with all of that. John Allan, a wealthy tobacco and dry goods merchant from Scotland, and Frances Allan, who had herself been an orphan, adopted Poe as a wealthy but childless couple, as Poe's older brother and younger sister went to live with other families. Poe grew up in a life of luxury in the antebellum South, playing games with enslaved black children and others on his family's lands. When Poe was 6, the Allans took him to live in London for 5 years, where Poe got fine marks in fancy schools before returning to Richmond, Virginia. That would show you the whole lay of the land as far as humanity a lot. And Poe seems sympathetic with the emotions and logic and thinking as someone who considers himself quite brilliant. When Poe was 16, John Allan's uncle died, and Poe's adopted father became far more wealthy, inheriting 3 large plantations and many slaves worth many millions today. Perhaps again $1 billion or $2 billion. I am not the one with those numbers. Poe began acting out, taking long midnight adventures, wandering with friends, getting into trouble, and annoying Allan with pranks, such as dressing up as a ghost to frighten guests at dinner parties. I like his spirit. Oddly, the Ku Klux Klan would similarly and sadly around the same time dress up as ghosts to frighten, or just after, I suppose, the Civil War, to frighten poor black freed slaves, not wealthy white socialites, decades after the American Civil War. In those decades, which Poe didn't really live to see at all. Of course, he died in the 1840s, before all that. Poe's older brother, Henry, visited, who grew up in Boston and worked as a sailor. This is going to be important for the first of the stories, in which these details I'm pulling out resemble the first story very much, the detective and the narrator as friends. His brother was a drunken sailor, as the Irish sea shanty of Poe's day goes, carousing dangerously about town with stories of the sea, and probably other unmentionable things. At 18, Poe enrolled at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. It's been in the news. Founded by Thomas Jefferson in 1819, and still under construction in 1826, and there was quiet sadness. Jefferson died as Poe's going on. There was quiet sadness when Jefferson died later that year. Jefferson himself died Poe's freshman year, freeing 7 slaves. In fact, I did look it up. I was going to say freeing his slaves, and then I was like, I'm going to look it up. He freed 7 slaves, but he actually passed off several hundred more, which were part of the estate. So actually, he freed these slaves. This is exactly like the wheel doesn't touch the ground if 99% of it doesn't, according to the ancient Chinese lawyers. So yes, and logicians, yes, and I love all that. And so yeah, he freed his slaves, 7 of them. You know what I mean? Yeah, I didn't sleep with a 17-year-old. That one, that one. I slept with not a 17. I mean specifically one, not another one. But that's not important right now. I'm not talking about me. I'm talking about other people. You know, and Poe, unfortunately, I think married his 14-year-old cousin. But we will get to that and men of their times right now, away from myself. Poe racked up drunken gambling debts. Again, look at this guy. And when Poe came home after his first year in college, Allan told him he would no longer support the education Poe was wasting. Poe learned that his love had become engaged, but not to him, as her father had intercepted all of his letters and married her off to someone else. The third story, the Purloined letter, is about an intercepted letter. All of that causing consequences in spite of love, in which I suppose still endured. The Poe denounced Allan and set sail with his friend up the East Coast, visiting his brother on their way to Boston. Poe told his creditors he had crossed the Atlantic to fight for Christian Greek independence from the Islamic Ottoman Empire in the name of Western civilization to dodge his debts. Now, I do mention to people, the whole West being something other than Christendom, and then there's other Christians, but Christendom, sort of European Christendom as the Catholic Church, and then this or that Protestantism doesn't care or speak that way. Being into the Greeks as our civilization is actually a 1700s and onward thing for a lot of white folks as they got fancy, which is the 1700s and on that Europe had more money and power than the Islamic world. Between 1600 and 1700 was the transition. So it then became in the 1700s and 1800s important to free the Christian Greeks from the Ottomans, and that was done in the name of increasingly Western civilization. We've actually switched over after Auschwitz to saying more Western rather than white or Christendom or European, and that's the last few decades of describing how, I suppose, Jews and Christians and maybe others can all get along, alike. But with all of that, whether or not Poe believes in Western civilization or Christian Greek independence, which he may very well, He definitely spoke of idealism and then was simply dodging his debts, which is hilarious, and he does believe in this duplicitness and Dupin, others. Poe published a book of poetry and enlisted in the army, and it was almost shipwrecked off Cape Cod in a storm. Quite a life. Poe felt he had to leave the army to become a great writer, but he was accepted to West Point, the first and foremost American military academy, where he got high marks in math and French. Realizing that he could not rise in the ranks without wealth, French, by the way, Dupin, he never got to France, but he talked from the perspective of Paris and learned French in America. Realizing that he himself could not rise in the ranks without wealth, as upper officers all had a bunch of wealth, and, well, came from good families, and Allan still refused to share his with his wayward adopted son, even at West Point, Poe left. His fellow cadets gave him money to publish a book of his poetry, which he was composing and dedicating to several of them and reading poetry to them, and they loved it enough that they gave him money to publish his poetry, and he did, as his fellow Army barracks folks. Poe moved to Baltimore to live with his grandmother, aunt, and brother, who now, like Poe, was a poet as well as drunk, and also, unfortunately, unlike Poe yet, was dying. As Poe sought a career in the 1830s, new forms of printing, production, transportation, finance, and education created a boom in mass print, including books, newspapers, and magazines. And Poe became an aspiring writer, poet, editor, and critic, as American audiences grew along with factories, trains, and cities, modernization and industrialization. Poe is very much the architect and the inventor of the short story and the plot twist as media is speeding up and becoming shorter and shorter forms. Here I am telling you this on YouTube. Poe was even invested money in cheaper forms of printing and production. He would have found the internet amazing. Of course, owning a smartphone is hard, a bit, for plenty in the world. He would have found, and is not the cheapest of printing, but he would have found YouTube quite amazing because he wanted to spread the best and deepest ideas in the cheapest, simplest, stupidest way possible, as I will explain as we go along here, and thought that was spreading genius and thought. I happen to agree very much. So Poe worked in Baltimore, Richmond, Philadelphia, and New York, all the major American publishing centers. Between 1820 and 1840, the population of New York City doubled, and immigration increased sixfold. Think about all of the America now, dang it. And yeah, that again, the quickening of the pace of things, a lot of immigration making this place a very diverse place, diverse amongst the white folk. It's that, yes, and are they all white? Italians? I don't know. Are they full people? Who knows these things? Again, Poe is, as Carol was, related to Irish, and is probably aware that Brits and Americans don't like the Irish entirely, but we don't want the Irish. So, speaking of great humorists, who are sheer genius. So, the Andrew Jackson's presidency, there was a recent president who admired and imitates Andrew Jackson. In the age of immigration, Andrew Jackson's presidency of 1828 meant a new era of party machine politics, mass media, industrialization, and the Trail of Tears for Cherokees. Think about how different demographics are reading different newspapers about the Trail of Tears in their time and age. And other natives killed or forced from their lands, with debates in print about genocide was not a word until after Auschwitz, in fact, but about what was effectively, and people were talking about mass killing, genocide, slavery, savages, and civilization. Lots of philosophers and issues, too many to bring up right here, so we go on. In British common law, retreat until one's back is against the wall is typically required before killing in self-defense. But American law is far more permissive with stand your ground, with proactive violence in defense of life and livelihood right where you are and not backing up forever until the cops come, or don't, and then. Like the famous gunfight at the OK Corral, still called stand your ground laws today, and debated and more complicated than I will get into it at all. Many Europeans, including Hitler himself, not painting all the gun laws or not as Hitler, again being political or not, but Hitler and Wittgenstein, both themselves as German children, grew up occasionally reading and watching this or that with the cowboy hat on, as you imagine small children like in front of the TV screens. While that is a little anachronistic for each, They were effectively growing up as kids fascinated with cowboys and Indians. In an age, the vaqueros, yeah? In the age of lynching and anti-immigration, Poe knew anti-black racists were also anti-Irish, so he claimed his family was German. Poe? I don't know. City folks, afraid of many in their own cities, wanted to read sensational stories about theft, murder, and rape. This is YouTube. Imagining details beyond what newspapers were rapidly printing. YouTube again. The sorts of crimes at the center of each of Poe's 3 detective stories, which makes them seminal and groundbreaking for true crime, the short story, and mystery writers. Poe is one of the inventors of, as I keep hyping, the short story. The thrilling tale that hooks audiences in a few short, digestible pages, and he is said by some to have invented the murder mystery, the horror story, and is one of the first to write science fiction. In the 1830s, geologists publicly rejected the biblical account of the Earth's creation. Religion was giving way to science and popular culture, and Poe confronted the modern loss of cosmic meaning and afterlife, as found, famously and most famously, in the beak of Poe's famous raven, who squawks that the narrator will hold Lenore nevermore, as he mourns her loss in his luxurious library, and we don't hear whether or not there is or isn't an afterlife, and all of that is left mysterious in the age of science, religion, and all of it. Poe entered a newspaper contest for best story with a prize of $100 in 1831, decent for that time, certainly, and didn't win, but the paper published his submission anyway just before Poe's 23rd birthday. Here again, failure is often extremely awesome, just not in the ways we intend, and that is often the best things in life. What slowly builds we do not intend and can use best. Anyway, Poe was good at parodying newspapers, I parody myself, and magazine stories, using found material and giving it interesting twists. Poe wrote articles that were actually not real articles, mocking other articles, and then he didn't tell people that, which definitely get him in a bit of hot water or humor and admiration by many. Poe wanted his stories to be popular, but also the best, to satisfy commercial and critical tastes. He wants the average person to like it and the intellectual to like it. Poe wanted to please both the masses and intellectuals with different parts of the same text, and felt sorry for the, quote, demagogue-ridden public, end quote. This is very proto-Nietzsche. In English, with publishers thrusting what they want the public to want at everyone. Chomsky says the same of Bernays, who also says, I can look over the New York Times in the 1940s, not 1840s. I can see who's writing what for whom. Like, you can see, do homeless people get a lot of articles? Less than 1 in 500 in the New York Times, and that's a lefty rag according to many folks, which means homeless people don't have a lot of advocacy and money and power. So what you read in the paper or media at all, including me on YouTube, I've had some money and power in my life such that I can talk to you. Any story that's important, there's some money and power behind it. That is very Nietzsche and also very Foucault. Not good or bad, just everything. Knowledge is power, which is Schoolhouse Rock and everything worse. So it was the 70s. Poe said the magazine was a sign of the times. It still is. A digest of condensed information for a public that consumed more, faster, and had more to think about. I happily embrace this too. It's very postmodern, in fact, and he's proto-postmodern, thus just you have to embrace it or roll with it. Otherwise, you will just be a classicist all angry at the present. With many more texts now in industrialized reality, as Baudrillard would say, methods and examples than mere decades ago. So Poe put the greatest amount of thought into the smallest device that worked for the most amount of people. This again is YouTube. Poe hoped information would soon be even cheaper to get and give, such that new classes of works could be brought to the public, with the independent artist free from depending on others with money, and the humblest given as much attention as the exalted. In some ways, Poe would admire the internet, though like most things in life, he would probably also find it horrifying. But then again, that's Poe. Poe contributed his Man of the Crowd in 1840 to the first issue of Graham's Magazine, the first magazine to succeed at mass circulation, and the year after his Murders in the Rue Morgue, 1841, the first story and the next talk, what many say is the first modern detective story. During the next several years, as Poe wrote his second and third detective stories, the murder of Marie Roget, 1842-3, and the Purloined Letter, 1844-5. I did say 44, 45, 46, didn't I, earlier in the talk? Wrong! It was 41, 42, 43, 44, 45. Past me. And now we get past that. Sequels directly to the Rue Morgue. He also wrote some of his most treasured stories, including The Mask of the Red Death, 1842, The Pit and the Pendulum, 1842-3, and The Telltale Heart, a favorite of mine since grade school, 1843. I am going to return to these stories. I'm actually going to start doing videos on surreal movies and philosophical concepts and helping people to see philosophy concepts, or at least read things in ways, whether or not intended directly, but quite there for the taking, as a philosophy instructor for folks to digest with shorter videos on all sorts of media, including popular movies, etc. The shinin. Shh, you want to get sued? Then, so I will return to The Pit and the Pendulum and The Telltale Heart at some point, but I am simply going to jump to and stick to in this 3 succeeding talks, the first and the second and the third of the detective stories, which are undersung, but so important for me now. As Poe was publishing his final detective story, with the first 2 and other tales, only a few years before his death, he complained that magazine writers are often poor and the poor are despised in America more than anywhere else, and that his political views were not represented by any of the present parties, any one of any of them. Poe wrote to a friend after the success of his detective tales that they are ingenious. This is the quote that Lewis Carroll may have brought up visiting the home of a child friend, a young girl like Alice that he had a friendship with, it is understood, most platonically, and he was with her family, and he mentioned to her family in the memoirs of this woman, former girl, young girl that Carroll was hanging out with, and to whom he wrote letters back and forth. This is possibly what Poe brought up. And this happens to be in the book on Poe that Lewis Carroll owned, which is the only way I'm going to loosely connect Poe and Carroll thus. And that's all I need, because I'm not going to try to force these to overlap right now, rather than detail what I love in Poe and then later detail what I love in Carroll. And there's a lot more overlap with Carroll and Wittgenstein I like. So my primary interest is to connect all these thinkers to Wittgenstein rather than Carroll to Poe. But this is what Poe says that Carroll seems to have mentioned to others, which is very important for my reading of Carroll, because I believe he's hiding forms of Aristotle that are structural in those stories, as I'll get to, which has to do with this quote. That Poe wrote to a friend after the success of his detective tales that they are ingenious, but people think they are more ingenious than they are. They're simple and stupid, but they're also brilliant, which is what his narrator and detective tell us. Simple, stupid, emotional things. I just bury a girl alive, Poe says. It brings him in. You know, the smart, the stupid, they love burying a girl alive for some reason. Still do. It's crazy. You know, they don't love it, but you get it. It hooks them. So, simple, stupid, better. You know what I mean? Best. So, they are ingenious. But for the author, he says, and this is what Carroll mentions, for the author, there is not much genius in the detective, quote, unraveling a web which you yourself have woven for the express purpose of unraveling. And then he talks about, in that quote, working backwards. And Lewis Carroll liked playing music boxes backwards and liked reversals and mirror images of things, which is also important for my Carroll theories and published work here now, and a little bit of stuff. That if you work backwards, if you have an ingenious idea for who the murderer is, right? You then work backwards and obfuscate and hide. If you work backwards, it is ingenious, and that's what genius is made of, but the artist knows it's also simple and stupid and all too human, because the artist is often working backwards and other people aren't when they read the story forwards. This is the kind of thing where I'm going to beat a lot of literature and movies to death with philosophical concepts in many videos to follow the lectures and other things. When you read deeply into and rewatch works, many simple things emerge that you don't see at first, but that has a profound effect on you. I like sort of the Wittgensteinian behaviorist idea. It does affect you consciously. It doesn't have to subconsciously make conceptual sense. It does affect you like it does, and then we only reflect verbally or conceptually on it as we talk things out and rewatch things and rework things. And that is actually us coming to those concepts for the first time. Not secretly in the basement, but simply consciously through verbal practices, which is conceptualization, according to Wittgenstein, largely what we call it. That if you have already figured out what the twist is, and then you work backwards to make it work, it is the only genius human beings can do, but it's also simple and stupid, and children can do it. And that definitely is consistent with what Poe tells us again and again, through his detective and narrator, in these detective stories. Brilliant thinking is simple and stupid and childlike, but most people don't have the emotional fortitude to push forward caring in those sorts of ways, so they miss simple things that are logic, reason, everyday emotions, objects, and they miss, as the Taoists say, what most people rush past in order to be fancy and superior or scientific or right, like the cops, he says, who are not, thus, the detective says, able to figure out what happens in all these extraordinary cases like I can, is what Poe says through his detective. And that certainly is a stand-in for Poe. It would seem himself that he considered himself an extraordinary, emotional, strange duck. And because of that, he was more so the genius, a bit tortured, but he could come up with simple, brilliant things that truly make people think. Not just be better than others at thinking, but help others to see and think. And that part gets extraordinarily into Wittgenstein and why simple situational thinking rather than extensive formal logic is best for the average person, because it really is not making people think or doing their thinking for them. It is allowing them the possibilities to pivot and think with the simplest of things they see every day. What Poe calls in the first story, the profound. Things that are simple, that are connected to everything, are extremely profound. What Wittgenstein calls it, now I feel I can go on, in a sense, I would say. A deep feeling of that, and that those sorts of feelings are structural to logic and thought. And several people, I think Carroll mocks Boole specifically as a bit of the Mad Hatter, and people mocked Russell afterwards, as Wittgenstein probably knew. Some people want to get emotions out of logic, but they're actually cornerstones to logical thinking as connectives in a sense, or interwoven with. Because without motivation, there is nothing motivated. There is no thinking, no talking, no nothing, because thinking is motivated in situations. But I will get to all of that, again, as we talk out all of these talks, ranting a little about the over and meta connections here for myself. The point, though, with that quote is that Edgar Allan Poe says something brilliant, which Carroll seems to have quoted and reiterated to others. And it also seems something that Wittgenstein himself would appreciate. And Wittgenstein believes in the duck rabbit and backwards text. And the backwards text in his footnote seems to refer to Lewis Carroll. All that is decently solid. Beyond those connections, I cannot make much as direct quotes. But looking at things backwards is an excellent way of seeing the familiar in genius ways. Not always, but a lot because of that. All of that is structural to a lot of the videos I'm going to be doing over the next several days, because I plan on getting the Poe videos and the Carroll videos done over the next week. Slowly and surely and well, but yes, that is where we are aiming for. So let's finish off with this life here before we get to too long a talk. After only a few creative but troubled years, depressed and tormented by a demon, possibly dreaming, Poe overdosed on laudanum, a tincture of powdered opium that was legal and common for headaches, and became very sick. He didn't die from that alone. After a bit of recovery, just as Poe was ready to launch his own magazine and wed his first love, he fell into the hands of thugs who apparently plied him with drink. It is believed and argued by some, and I believe it is supported by scholars now somewhat, that he was taken around to voting precincts possibly to stack ballots, as drunk people were somewhat shanghaied in the day, and then left in the street. And unfortunately, like Shakespeare, he likely died drunk in the snow from, well, yeah, being out in the snow at night without getting indoors, falling asleep in the snow. Poe died after a few days in a hospital, unable to recover. So that is the conclusion of the first talk. So thank you for listening to that. I have a bit of a talk actually on the philosophy of furniture. And I will probably quickly deliver that, actually. This may turn into 5 talks now that I look at the notes. I am going to probably get quickly through, I have less to say, but there is some interesting things to say about Poe's philosophy of furniture. And then I am going to turn here to the hidden murder in the Rue Morgue. Now, I already have a video that I illustrated as best I could. I haven't had much time to illustrate that in my series on Itzy the Spider, which I made confusing to look up on YouTube on purpose because, yeah, there's so much Itsy on YouTube, believe it or not. If you have kids, you couldn't possibly. So the hidden murder in the Rue Morgue is already a video of mine, but I am here going to give a talk at length in which I give an entire lecture on which a short lecture, but a lecture explaining my theories more on that. That has been a popular video of mine more than most other things, as well as the stuff on postmodernism on my channel here. I get to notice that and check it by the minute, and I can see that, oddly enough, nowadays. Them's the technology in the industry. So that said, this is the conclusion of the talk on Poe's life. As usual, hopefully you are good and bad, or else you are possibly dead. And much love, much happiness, a little more than Poe, I would hope, and I will see you, if I do indeed ever see you.